Occasionally, what begins as a straightforward interview becomes something nobody, not even the host, would have anticipated. It was going to be just another standard night in late-night television. The regular lights, the shiny set, the familiar beat of giggles and applause. But when Meghan Markle appeared on Jimmy Kimmel's set that evening, something was different. The atmosphere was denser, the vibe keener. Perhaps it was the subtle tension in her shoulders or Jimmy's hesitation for a fraction of a second too long on his lead question. Whatever the reason, the audience didn't realize it yet, but they were about to watch one of the most memorable interviews ever broadcast on network television. Not out of shouting, not out of scandal, but out of two individuals, each with their own truth, their own hurt, their own need to be heard, finding themselves engaged in a battle that neither was prepared to lose. Now, you don't have to be a royalty fan or a frequent late-night comedy viewer to know what was truly occurring underneath. This wasn't about some talk show host and a guest. It was about what happens when public persona collides with private anguish, when media expectation crashes into real life, and when two individuals who perceive the world very, very differently attempt to make sense of each other in the moment, under bright lights, in front of millions of people. You could be wondering, why did this exchange go so terribly wrong? Was it an instance of hard questions at last being asked? Or had it crossed over into something sharper, perhaps even unbalanced? These are questions we've all wrestled with, especially in a world where so many of us have lived long enough to know that truth isn't always simple and real conversations aren't always polite. There's a certain weight that comes with perspective. When you've seen enough to recognize when someone's trying to be heard, and when someone else might be missing the bigger picture. And here, both of them felt that they were in the right. Meghan, in her measured tones and precise words, patently came prepared to tell her story. A story informed by privilege, indeed, but also by isolation, backlash, and a very personal grappling with discrimination. Jimmy, normally the jovial go-between of jokes and film plugs, played a different role that evening. One that called for accountability, for context, for a new type of truth. But the queries continued to grow sharper. The grins began to fade. And before long, what was supposed to be a dignified conversation turned into something quite harder to behold, and even more challenging to unwind. And perhaps it is this which makes the story worth reliving. Because we all know what it's like to enter a room believing we'll be heard, yet discover ourselves having to justify things we believed didn't need justification. We've all been in discussions that began one way and ended with us wondering if we were sane, our words, our motivation, our place in the narrative. This wasn't a celebrity moment. It was a mirror held up to some of the hardest discussions we're having today. Discussions about race, about responsibility, about what we're willing to listen to from people who don't view the world precisely the way that we do. And for anyone who's ever felt stuck in the middle of telling their story and being misheard, this one might strike close to home. So let's take a stroll through all that went down that night. The subtle pivots, the turning points, the times where things could have turned out differently, but didn't. Because whether you sympathize with Meghan, with Jimmy, or somewhere in between, one thing's certain. This wasn't just another interview, it was a reckoning. Let's get into it. What happens when one of the most talked about royals in modern times sits down across from late-night TV's most quick-witted host, only for the conversation to veer into uncharted territory? Tonight, we're unpacking one of the most jaw-dropping celebrity interview moments in recent memory. A moment where polished public images collided with raw, uncomfortable honesty. And what followed was a TV segment so gripping, it had audiences instantly choosing sides. But first, let's dissect it all. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to tell me your theories in the comments. What do you really think went down when the camera stopped rolling? Because let me tell you, this interview suggested a whole lot more than made it on the air, and I want to hear your thoughts. Now imagine this. The studio on Jimmy Kimmel Live was humming with expectation that evening. The guest booker had hit a home run, landing an interview with someone who's been the subject of both Hollywood and Royal Palace headlines. It was the type of booking that promised blockbuster ratings. Nobody had any idea, though, how hot things would become. Jimmy Kimmel sauntered out onto the stage with his characteristic swagger. But in the wings, sources claim he had spent extra prep time preparing. His research team had put together an in-depth, page after page, because this wasn't just another celebrity interview. This guest arrived with a legacy, a fan base, and quite a bit of controversy. And now, please, welcome Meghan Markle, Jimmy declared, flashing that well-known smile. The crowd erupted with applause. Meghan walked out in a sleek navy blue dress, posture straight, that practiced royal wave at full display. She took her seat like a pro, someone who's done more than her fair share of high-pressure interviews. But some of them caught on immediately. A tension in her shoulders. A subtle one, but significant. Like she sensed this wasn't going to be your typical civilities Q&A. "Thank you for inviting me, Jimmy," she said smoothly, her voice imbued with that smooth tone she has developed over the years. "Of course, thanks for coming," Jimmy answered. "I have to say, whenever you're on TV, social media nearly bursts. People have very strong feelings about you. Some good, some less than good. How do you handle that sort of attention?" On the surface, the question had been innocuous. Typical late-night material. A little icebreaker. But the fact that Jimmy rested so heavily on the term negative wasn't lost. Meghan's smile blinked, a single flicker, a moment of something behind the eyes. "Fine, Jimmy," she answered, calm but resolute. "When you live your life honestly and speak your truth, there's going to be people who stand up behind that, and some who won't. What's important to me is being faithful to the things I believe in and the things I'm fighting for." "Right. Your truth," Jimmy replied, smiling knowingly. "That's become quite the catchphrase, hasn't it? I mean, your truth, my truth, seems like everyone's got their own truth these days. But what about just, the truth? Like actual facts?" You might sense a change in the atmosphere. The crowd sensed it immediately. Something in the tone had shifted. This was not going to be the usual celebrity endearment session. Meghan's instincts as a news person kicked in a matter of seconds, softening her face. But for a split second, annoyance flashed across her face. It was quick, but authentic. "I believe lived experience is fact, Jimmy," she replied, her voice still calm but harder now. "If a person tells you how they've been treated, how they've felt, that's their reality. That's not debatable." "Yeah, sure thing," Jimmy replied, still sporting his trademark smile. "But sometimes, perception and reality do not necessarily coincide, right? Like I think I'm just extremely good-looking and charming, but my wife might have a very different reality about that." The crowd laughed, but not that same free way that they normally did. It was instead a laugh of nervousness, the kind you see when folks aren't sure whether or not it's proper to be laughing. Jimmy's joke stung just a little, like there was something further coming. Meghan didn't skip a beat. "There is a huge distinction between cracking a self-deprecating joke," she replied, her tone still measured but distinctly firmer, "and dismissing an individual's personal experience with discrimination or abuse." "Absolutely," Jimmy said promptly. "Discrimination is serious, really serious. But here's something I find interesting. You've told us how you were discriminated against, how you felt unsupported, and that does sound terrible. Nobody should have to put up with that. But then there are others, staff members, who've also come forward with their own accounts, their own truths about dealing with you. So, how do we determine whose truths count the most?" Silence. The room fell utterly silent. This clearly wasn't where anyone expected the interview to go. Meghan shifted slightly in her seat. Her smile was still there, but now it looked more rehearsed, more like a shield. "I think what you're referring to," she said carefully, "are anonymous accusations that were never proven. It's interesting that you choose to give more weight to unnamed sources over someone sitting right here, openly sharing their story." Jimmy didn't let up. "But that's the thing. Some of those sources aren't anonymous anymore. And they're not just random voices. These are experienced professionals, people who say they were mistreated. If we're saying people's experiences should be believed, shouldn't all experiences count, even if they're hard to hear?" The tension within the room was palpable now. You could spot Meghan's team at the back of the stage, growing increasingly uncomfortable. The audience? Completely silent. It was as if everyone collectively knew that they were witnessing something unusual, raw, unfiltered, and on the verge of going off script. Meghan leaned forward. Her tone was calm, but you could feel the gravity of her words. Jimmy, what you're doing here, this is part of the issue. You're elevating accusations, many of which were being spread as part of a larger attempt to undermine me, to the same platform as documented incidents of racism and institutional prejudice. That isn't considerate discussion. That's tabloid grist. Jimmy raised both hands a little bit. Whoa, hold up. I'm not a journalist. I'm a comedian. But I do attempt to pose reasonable questions. And I think it's reasonable to say that if we expect to make people believe your truth, then we need to be willing to listen to other people's truths as well, even the uncomfortable ones. Things were escalating, quickly. What had begun as a typical late-night conversation had escalated into something much more heated. Meghan's poised coolness was beginning to fray, and Jimmy, to his credit or fault, depending on your perspective, wasn't giving an inch. The tension now was impossible to ignore. What's really awkward, Jimmy, Meghan replied, her voice strained, is sitting here while you essentially imply I'm lying on national television. What's awkward is having my character dissected under the pretense of asking reasonable questions. Never called you a liar, Jimmy fired back. What I am wondering is consistency. You've spoken about your experience, one that ought to be met with empathy and respect. But when other individuals come forward with a different experience of working with you, suddenly they're dismissed as liars or as being part of an attack. I'm simply trying to understand. The crowd was stone silent now, totally focused on what had the feel of less interview and more verbal standoff. Every exchange cut a little sharper than the one before it, trying a tennis game in which the ball just kept being hit more and more forcefully. Meghan leaned forward in her chair, and her tone fell slightly. Longtime viewers would have known that tone. It was the same measured, controlled delivery she tended to fall into when things were going to get serious. Let me be very clear, Jimmy, she said slowly. The individuals you're referring to, those so-called professional staff members, were a part of a system which was constructed to shut me up from the very start. When you're the lone person of color in an institution which has never had to overcome its own biases, complaining about discrimination somehow automatically is being difficult. That's not a coincidence. Jimmy leaned away slightly, plainly feeling the gravity of what she was telling him, but he did not step back. See, that's what I'm trying to get, he explained. You've presented compelling arguments about race, and I think racism is real and must never be discounted. But some of the grievances you faced were from individuals who also worked with members of your family. They came from different backgrounds, had different pasts, and they described their experience with you as different. Isn't it reasonable to inquire about it? Meghan's smile was erased now. Her face was stern, even hurt. Because you're drawing a false equivalence, she said, her voice rising. You're taking general workplace disagreements, which occur everywhere, and using them to challenge my credibility when I talk about systemic racism. That's the way these systems insulate themselves. They make the person who's raising the concerns the problem. Jimmy nodded, but then held up a hand a little, as if to diffuse the heat. Okay, but listen, he said. What if both of them were true? What if you actually did experience racism, which was wrong and should totally be denounced? And also there were some legitimate issues with management style or the way things were being done. Why does it have to be one or the other? That question hung. It wasn't a rhetorical one. It just sat there like a weight that the entire room had to wait out. You saw Meghan take a breath. Her media training was straining to keep up, but her annoyance was breaking through. When she answered, her voice was tighter, more intimate. Because that is not how the world works, Jimmy, she replied. When you are a woman of color in a leadership position, every choice you make is torn apart. Every time you stand up for yourself or stand up for your team, you're labeled difficult or demanding. But when men do the very same thing, they are regarded as strong, decisive. That double standard pervades everywhere. Jimmy shook his head slowly. I understand you. I understand, he said. But this is what I don't get. You had the access to the best PR companies, the leading media specialists, essentially all of the resources money can provide. Literally, you were a part of the royal family, Jimmy whispered. If there were issues with how the staff was being dealt with, Wouldn't the solution be to, I don't know, deal with things in another way, rather than abandon the entire institution? The viewers could sense it. They were seeing something unusual, something you don't see on late-night television. This wasn't a celebrity publicity tour or a feel-good fluff piece. Jimmy was posing the questions many had considered, but few had ever had the courage to ask out loud, particularly on a stage this large. You're reducing a very complex situation to simply terms, Meghan said, her tone rising just a hair. When you are part of a couple of 100-years-old institution with very set ways of doing things, and you bring in new ideas, new thought, and you attempt to bring that into the modern age, even if it's just a little bit, there's going to be pushback. The question is whether that institution will change, or whether it pushes out anybody who will challenge the way things have always been done. But that's the point exactly, Jimmy shot back, still respectful, but insistently. You knew what you were getting into, didn't you? You knew about Harry, his past, the ways of the royal family and their rules. None of that was kept secret. So why become part of something so old-fashioned if you didn't approve of how it was being done? For the first time during the interview, Meghan looked absolutely taken aback. She hesitated just a moment, and her face changed. That's, kind of a presumptuous thing to say, she said, obviously flustered but standing firm. To think I didn't do my homework is not fair. Naturally, I was aware of the generalities, but there's a world of difference between knowing about something intellectually and living it on a day-to-day basis. Knowing the royal family is old-fashioned is one thing. Knowing those traditions involve accepting racism, that's something else altogether. Jimmy didn't blink. Sure, okay. But if you found that those traditions were the issue, particularly with regard to race, why not remain and battle for change from within? You had a platform, you had a voice, and you had Harry by your side. Did going away really have to be the only solution? Meghan responded hastily, and in this instance the resentment was more pronounced in her tone. Because change only occurs from within when the individuals who hold power desire such change, she explained. When you spend all day fighting just to be heard, when your ideas are dismissed, when you're constantly undermined, when you see nothing's going to change no matter how much effort you put in, at some point you need to ask yourself, is this fight worth your peace, your health, your life, or is your energy elsewhere? Jimmy nodded slowly, contemplatively. But then, without so much as a hesitation, he went even further. Let me ask you this, he said. In your Netflix show, in the Oprah interview, and a number of other talk shows, you've told your side. You've talked about feeling alone, unsupported, even suicidal, and that's very serious. I think a lot of people were truly moved by what you disclosed. And then he fell silent for a moment. But here's what I want to know. In all those discussions, have you ever admitted that perhaps, just perhaps, some of the disagreement wasn't so one-sided? That one stung. You could see it on Meghan's face immediately. Her trained composure cracked wide open. Her eyes flared, and when she replied, her tone was biting, cutting. Are you actually asking me to be responsible for having been a target of racism? She asked. Are you asking me to apologize for not having been more civil in dealing with institutional discrimination? Jimmy held up a hand. No, that's not what I'm saying, he replied quickly. I'm talking about accountability. I'm asking if, alongside being mistreated, there's also room to consider that some of the workplace conflicts, some of the complaints from staff, might have been valid and unrelated to race. This is exactly what I'm talking about, Meghan fired back, sitting up straighter in her chair. This is the pattern. Every single time a woman of color speaks out, the focus shifts. Suddenly it's all about what she could have done differently, how she should have handled things, what she should apologize for. That's not accountability. That's gaslighting, Jimmy. I'm not gaslighting you, Jimmy replied, his voice still measured. What I'm attempting to do is leave room for a fuller conversation. I believe it's possible that more than one thing can be true. Your truth, your experience with racism, is true. But so may be the experience of a person who felt the work environment was challenging for other reasons. To acknowledge their truth does not negate yours. But Meghan wasn't hearing it. Except that's not how things go in the real world, she went on, her tone harder. When folks hear those gripes, they don't say, oh, there are multiple truths. They employ those criticisms to disqualify all of what I've done talking about systemic racism. It's always, she's the issue, not the institution. There was a long silence. You could sense Jimmy considering hard about what to say next. But what if, he said softly, what if the intention isn't to gloss over what you experience? What if it's to have an honest, authentic conversation? What if we were able to discuss both, leadership and racism, without one negating the other? Meghan exhaled, this time not frustration so much as exhaustion. Because that's not how the media operates, she answered, her voice now a blend of exhaustion and flame. The minute you expose any weakness, that gets distorted. If I'm honest about even the tiniest mistake, that gets manipulated into a headline. Meghan admits she was the problem. There's no room for subtlety in this limelight. The crowd was absolutely silent, hanging on. Most of them were leaning forward, hooked on her every word. They sensed this dialogue crossing over into new ground. Something honest, something true. Jimmy glanced over at her. He appeared to make a decision. Retreat and change the tone, or push on into even more painful terrain. He opted for the latter. So I want to ask you straight out, he said, his voice level but stern. And I hope you'll answer me straight out. Do you think it's possible, just possibly, that some of the individuals who worked with you had valid issues about communication or management style that had absolutely nothing at all to do with your gender or race? Meghan looked at him, her jaw clenched, and for a second she did not speak. The room was so quiet, you could sense the gentle click of a camera adjusting. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, low, but it was potent. Now what I believe, Jimmy, she said slowly, is that you've spent the whole course of this interview trying to make me admit to doing something wrong, and utterly disregarding the very real, documented history of the harassment and discrimination I experienced. What I believe, Meghan went on, her voice now trembling a bit, is that you're more concerned with creating a viral moment than engaging in an honest, substantive conversation about racism or institutional responsibility. Jimmy stared at her straight on, and in a tone considerably graver than his typical late-night tone, he replied with surprising frankness. Know what? You're right, he replied. I do want a viral moment, but not of the sort you're imagining. What I want is a moment when someone of your voice and your influence actually discusses the hard questions, truly discusses them, instead of skirting them. That would be worth something. His words had an immediate effect. Meghan's face changed, shock going over her skin. For a moment, she said nothing. When she did speak, her voice shook, held together by a sheer willpower. Deflecting? She echoed, amazed. You think I'm deflecting when I'm attempting to explain systemic racism to someone who obviously doesn't want to listen? You think being called out for my bias is dodging the issue? Jimmy remained firm. His voice remained level, but his words stung. Yeah, I believe, he spoke slowly, that you've constructed much of your public reputation on being the victim of circumstances over which you really had more control than you're ready to acknowledge. And when someone calls into question that hypocrisy, even politely, you at once switch the subject to racism. As if that washes away every professional disagreement, every critique, every instance of pushback you've ever experienced. The audience gasp was palpable. A few of those in the front row leaned forward, mouths agape. This wasn't merely uncomfortable, it was unprecedented. Jimmy had done something no one expected him to do. Meghan rose from her seat, hands visibly shaking. Her voice quivered with emotion. Are you kidding me? She exclaimed. You just summed up all the racist things I've heard, all the nights I lay awake thinking I didn't fit in, to an excuse? You think I'm invoking racism to excuse bad actions? Jimmy got up too, his tone strong but not loud. That's not what I said, he answered. I said racism exists. I said your experiences matter. But that doesn't preclude every single complaint about your behavior from being invalid. It doesn't eliminate accountability. Meghan came closer to his desk, her voice rising now, trembling with anger. Do you even hear yourself? You're doing exactly what people always do in these situations. You're saying, sure, racism exists, but maybe you're just a difficult person. That's classic gaslighting. And you're doing exactly what people do when they don't want to take responsibility for anything. And then Jimmy snapped. Hiding behind identity politics, he said, his own restraint breaking at last. You respond as though any criticism is discrimination, and nobody can challenge you without being labeled a bigot. The words fell like a bomb. The studio dropped into stunned silence. You could hear the quiet buzzing of the cameras, the movement of someone shifting in the back row. The crowd wasn't just observing a contentious exchange anymore. They were seeing a total collapse. Meghan's face changed quickly, shock, disbelief, pain, before settling into something darker, something intimate. Her words that came next were low and dead serious. Identity politics, she said slowly. You just referred to my experience of racism as identity politics? Do you even know what you just said? Meghan said, her tone low but forceful. Jimmy appeared to pick up on the fact that he had overstepped, but instead of backing down, he stood his ground. I'm saying, he replied, that not all conflict in your life is a matter of discrimination. Eventually, personal responsibility has to come into the discussion as well. Personal responsibility? Meghan replied, her head shaking in incredulousness. Let me explain personal responsibility to you, Jimmy. Her voice grew more acerbic now, not defensive, but belligerent. Personal responsibility is standing up when you know it would be easier to just shut up. It's putting your reputation, your comfort level, even your safety on the line to speak out about mistreatment. Personal responsibility is speaking out and drawing attention to the things that are important to you, even when you know people like you are going to make fun of you for it. Personal responsibility, she went on, is recognizing when you need to leave a toxic situation rather than staying and faking it in order to keep the peace. Jimmy didn't blink. He came back at him with his own take on the same line. And personal responsibility, he replied, is also about seeing the part you have in creating that landscape. It's about knowing that being a leader is about taking responsibility, not what you're left with, but what you build. That includes the way people around you are treated, well or poorly. Meghan let out a hard, unfunny laugh. It wasn't a laugh that would lighten the atmosphere. Instead, it made the situation seem heavier. Do you want to discuss the environment I established? She snapped. I established an office where individuals were encouraged to be professional and efficient, where new thinking was encouraged, where every individual, regardless of background, was to be treated with respect. If that irritated some individuals, then I'll own it. But what about, Jimmy urged, the accounts from within that same setting? What about the accounts from staff who reported that they didn't feel safe reporting, that they worried about being retaliated against, that some of them were shouted at, dismissed, or pushed to the extent that they quit? What about that? Allegedly, snapped Meghan. All of it, allegedly, on the basis of anonymous sources. Individuals who were never willing to come on the record. Individuals who had every motive to smear me. You're asking me to defend myself against rumors and innuendo and totally disregard actual evidence of the harassment and discrimination I faced. Jimmy's voice was still even, but insistent. The harassment you experienced was wrong. Nobody's arguing that point. It shouldn't have happened at all. But that doesn't mean the fears other people had are automatically untrue. Perhaps both things are happening. Meghan's face set. Her voice rose a little. Not yelling, but definitely getting close to it. No, Jimmy, they can't both be true. Not the way you're framing it. Because when you equate unproved charges with documented racism, you're not making a fair discussion. You're affirming the same broken system that drove me out in the first place. There was a beat of quiet. You could sense the heft in the room. Then Jimmy stepped forward, his tone sharper now. Or perhaps, he said, I'm merely trying to have an honest dialogue, one that no one else appears willing to engage in with you. Perhaps I'm being kind enough to treat you as someone who can take the hard questions, rather than behaving as if you're too delicate to withstand any sort of criticism whatsoever. There was no doubt about it. The insult had stuck, and it was intentional. Meghan's face colored, her features now twisted with anger. When she spoke, her voice shook, not with fear, but with raw anger. Fragile? She said again, shocked. You think standing up for myself against racism makes me fragile? You think speaking out for myself and for others makes me a victim? She crept forward, her voice slicing. Let me show you what actual fragility looks like, Jimmy. It's feeling so threatened by a woman of color who is willing to stand up for herself that you spend an entire interview attempting to dismantle her. I'm not trying to knock you down, Jimmy said hastily, but the words didn't have the oomph they'd had before. He sounded uncertain, exhausted even. I'm trying to get it, he continued, trying to get how somebody with your education, your means, your platform, how you continue to find yourself in these situations where everybody else is at fault but you. That was when it cracked. Meghan stood up, ripped her microphone off her lanyard, and plopped it on the chair. The clunk resounded through the studio like a period at the end of a sentence. The atmosphere in the room tautened. Listen, Jimmy. Forget it, she said, moving from her chair. I came here thinking I was going to have a decent conversation with somebody who actually understands how messy these are. What do I get instead? I get interrogated by somebody who had already determined who I was before I sat down. Her heels hit the studio floor hard as she moved toward the door. Realizing what was going on, Jimmy leapt to his feet, verbally reaching out to reclaim the moment. Meghan, wait, please. I believe we're having a crucial conversation here. Don't you think it's worth seeing through? She whirled around, her eyes afire. Important? You say that this is important? Her voice had climbed now, not shouting but firm, loud and infused with betrayal. You've spent the past 20 minutes attempting to get me to apologize for being treated poorly. You, a lawyer, have minimized what I've endured, implied that it's my fault I've been discriminated against, and you believe that's what the world should hear? Jimmy paused. I believe honest, hard conversations are important. Meghan let out a bitter, dry laugh. It did nothing to lighten the atmosphere. It exacerbated the pain. There was nothing authentic about this, she said. You've used your platform, one that millions tune in to watch, to perpetuate the same old tired, harmful narratives that compelled me to move back from public life initially. And then tonight, you demonstrated precisely why people like me can't help but feel unsafe putting their trust in people like you. The studio was silent, uncomfortably so. The air felt heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath. People like me? Jimmy asked quietly, no longer defensive, just stunned. Meghan nodded slowly. Yes, people who think they're being fair, but are really just upholding the same systems that silence people like me. People who confuse gotcha questions with journalism. People so wrapped up in their own version of the truth that they stop listening entirely. She picked up her purse from beside the chair. Jimmy made one last appeal. Meghan, please, I hope you'll reconsider. There's more to say here. At the edge of the stage, she paused, turned back, and met his eyes one last time. You're right, Jimmy, she said calmly. There is more to discuss, Meghan said, her voice steady now. But not with you, and not like this. She took a breath, her eyes never leaving Jimmy's. Because what you've done here tonight isn't a conversation, it's an ambush, and I'm not going to stand here and be part of it anymore. And with that, she turned and walked off the stage. Jimmy remained at his desk, still silent, unsure of what to say. The studio audience didn't clap, didn't move. No laughter, no outro music, just stunned silence. The cameras rolled on for another few seconds, taking in the stunned expression etched on the room before cutting to commercial. But it was too late. What was originally supposed to be a lighthearted celebrity interview had now been transformed into something much more intense, a public confrontation that would be dissected, analyzed, and argued about for months. This wasn't a talk show segment anymore. It was a cultural flashpoint. The tension in that studio was unlike anything a late-night show had ever experienced. Two heavyweight figures, each embodying profoundly different visions of the world, had come at each other hammer and tongs in real time. No scripts, no rehearsals, no respectable middle ground. Neither side had moved, and all that mattered was a moment that was simultaneously riveting and painfully uncomfortable. The sort of television that commands millions of sets of eyes and an equal number of opinions. So now it's in its hands. What did you make of this volatile exchange? Did Jimmy cross the line with his grilling? Or was he finally getting tough questions out on the table that others have shied away from? Let's discuss this. Drop your thoughts in the comments section below. Be kind, but be authentic. I want to hear from you how you perceive it. And while you're here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more in-depth analysis into today's hottest celebrity gossip. Because if this showdown taught us anything, it's that even the most meticulously scripted interviews can utterly turn train wrecks when emotions get high and truth becomes personal. And sometimes that's when the real story begins.